This morning's scripture reading is from Mark chapter 10. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" They replied, "Appoint us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" And they replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. With the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to appoint, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize are their rulers, and they lord over them. And they greet the ones that are tyrants over them. But it's not so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave to all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." May we be granted wisdom and courage for interpretation.
And a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path. Okay, y'all. Y'all are going to have to walk along with me with this because this was a difficult scripture for me to put together in a sermon. In fact, this morning I had an insight and changed everything at the last second. So here we go. Now, James and John, they were brothers. They were two of the 12 of Jesus' closest disciples, two of this close-knit group of friends who walked and talked and ate and traveled and learned together. They were living a life that none of them had anticipated, but it seems that the rewards must have been profound, or maybe they didn't know what else to do because they kept following Jesus. But James and John thought they had down what Jesus was up to. They saw lives changed, they saw groups of people transformed, and they wanted to be on the leading edge of this movement. And so they went to Jesus and asked for promotions. Listen, we've given up everything, we're here, we know what to expect, and we think when this new kingdom takes hold that we should be your left and right hand men. Really? Says Jesus. Then what? Say the disciples. Who do you think you are? The other 10. Well, those two were two of the first 4 disciples called. 2 sons gone from the same family. And this certainly would have been a tremendous strain on their parents. They and their family had sacrificed a lot for them to be disciples. And they'd been with Jesus the whole time. And, it does seem like it might have been time to ask for a promotion. Oftentimes we hear about James and John as being arrogant and clueless. and talking to Jesus in this way. But when I think about it, it's kind of confusing. After all, weren't they told to let their lights shine? Weren't they promised that things would be great? Weren't they promised that they were living in the light of God? And I want to be successful. And I think probably you do too. We all do. Perhaps it wasn't so much that James and John wanted to succeed or wanted to sit in glory. Perhaps it was that in wanting power, they'd overstepped their bounds. Maybe they'd gotten a little too big for their britches. Their desire for greatness superseded their desire to learn. Perhaps they were so enthralled with all that Jesus was doing, seeing the influence that he had on others, that they wanted to be part of that, not realizing that his path was his path, and they each had their own paths to walk. The 12 and the other disciples that had been following Jesus had been with him for quite some time. They were with him when a Syrophoenician woman helped Jesus see the error of his ways, and they saw Jesus admit that he was wrong and she was right. They were with him when he healed a deaf and blind man, and then they saw him ask him not to talk about it. When he healed him, he said, "Don't make a big to-do about it. After all, really, all things are possible with God." And they were with him when a crowd of thousands were fed to their fill with even leftovers to boot, when they themselves thought there wasn't food for anyone. They were with him when the blind man from Bethesda was the first to experience a modern eye exam. Jesus heals him and then turns him to the crowd and said, "Is it better now or now?" The man says, "Well, if those are people, they look like trees walking around." And Jesus says, "Well, how about now?" And then he says, "Don't go in the village, really. Everybody's going to stop you and want to know about this. Just go home. Just go live. Go see." They were with him when Jesus told them that his way of living, his way of being in the world was one that disrupted the power dynamics of the day, and that he knew he wasn't going to get out of this life unscathed. They were there when they encountered someone that they didn't know who was preaching and healing according to the teachings of Jesus, and they were upset. The inner circle was offended and reported this to Jesus and said, "We're going to go shut this down." And Jesus said, "Come on, man. If they're not against us, then they're for us. Leave him be. Let them continue in mercy." They were there when Jesus welcomed children to him, something the high and mighty of his time would never have done. They were there for all of it. And yet, they griped and they complained about only having one loaf of bread as they took a boat ride immediately following one of the biggest object lessons in history, that there would be plenty. They saw Jesus turn to Peter, his friend, and call him evil for tempting him, for trying to persuade him that he's great and that danger wouldn't come to him as long as he kept being great. They argued on the road to Capernaum about which one of them was really the best, the greatest. And Jesus set them all down and said over and over, "Pay attention. No one is going to be first. In fact, in this new society of which I speak, of which I believe, of which I work toward, the first must be servants to all." And even after all of that, James and John come up to Jesus and ask to be his consiglieres. Now, questions of the soul are questions of meaning, purpose, and direction. We all have them at all ages. I know I've heard lots of times that James and John were just power hungry, that they demanded too much for themselves. But I wonder if perhaps they were ready. They really were ready for something bigger. Perhaps they discerned a pull to the next step in life. And perhaps they finally understood what Jesus was pointing them to this different worldview, a different way of being in the world. And they were asking to connect to that, to be intimately involved in this world, and that they were only able to use the imagery, the only worldview that they really knew. They didn't know Jesus's path was his own, that to take the step they wanted, they would have to claim their own paths. We've all known people that somehow pull us into a bigger worldview than what we had before knowing those people. They attract us to them. They seem grounded in life and not overcome by it. They speak and they act in ways that make us know that there is more. They expand our horizons. They help us to see other angles to what is right in front of us. We are better people because of our experiences with them. There is something maybe even sacred about them, and we want to be close. We want to know them, to have a part of whatever it is that they have. I went to divinity school in North Carolina, and I was to finish in the summer, but on Maundy, Thursday, as I was driving to the church where I was working and where I was to lead the service that evening, I was in a terrible car crash. The bridge that came in where I was sitting smashed my leg in 6 places, and I was in a cast for 4 months. And for most of those, it was a cast up to my hip, and I couldn't fit in a car. So I finished my 3 classes by completing a directed study with a beloved professor, beginning clinical pastoral education at Loma Linda University Medical Center in Loma Linda, California, which I had never had any intention of doing, didn't want to be a chaplain, and then ended up working to become a CPE supervisor. And by taking a class at the Claremont School of Theology with a wonderful professor named Howard Kleinbell. It was called Methods of Holistic Peacemaking. We began with a project that was directed at our personal lives, how to make peace with oneself, and then how to make peace with others. And then finally, the third project was how to make peace within the world. I loved this class. I jumped in wholeheartedly, and whenever there was a request for someone to share their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, I was right there. I was pretty confident. I wasn't rude to others, but I was sure of myself. There was a woman in my class whom I liked a lot. She was so smart and so wise. She was older, about 40, and she asked me out for drinks. And after chatting for a while, and after me peppering her with questions about her experiences and her plans, she said, "Janet, I wish I could just open your head and pour in everything I know." Well, that was brilliant. I said, "Well, why don't you? Why don't we meet regularly and you can tell me all the things I need to know?" And I was honest. I was earnest, and I thought that was brilliant. And she took a sip and gazed over the top of her martini. You see, she was sophisticated and drank martinis. And she said, "I can't. You have to learn what you need to know. What I've learned won't be what you need to learn. We can check in. We can compare notes. We're headed in the same direction, but you've got your path, and it's not mine." I didn't really have any clue what she was talking about. But I've had a hint at what she meant, but it wasn't until working on this sermon that I really understood. Perhaps this was the experience that James and John had. What they didn't seem to understand is that the glory of which Jesus spoke was not something marked by a powerful political entity. This wasn't a new ruling structure. Perhaps the glory and greatness of which Jesus spoke was not something to be bestowed upon them. Perhaps it was something into which they had to be transformed. Jesus took their request seriously. You know, they've been kind of denigrated by society, by history and sermons, but Jesus didn't make them feel foolish. And nor does Jesus say no to them. He does tell them, I don't think you really know what you're asking. This glory and greatness I seek are not what you think will be asked of you. He tells them this glory doesn't look like what they might think. This glory takes the form of cup and baptism. The cup is the cup of self-surrender. It's a choice between the will to power and the will to meaning and life. It's opening oneself and listening for a call to live a life that is more than just consumption. It's a life full of curiosity and merciful creativity. It's understanding that the well-being of others is inextricably linked to our own well-being. It's knowing that there is enough in all of creation for all of us if we don't hoard it, if we share. It's admitting that we're wrong so that we can open ourselves to a more expansive worldview. It's letting go of needing to prove anything to others or expecting them to prove anything to us. That baptism is a willing immersion into a life that's larger and beyond ourselves, our worldviews, our preconceived notions, our prejudices, our protected egos. It's living in a topsy-turvy world, a world where the last is first, where the meek inherit what they need, where the powerful become servants. Swimming in these baptismal waters, we learn to love our neighbors, to seek justice for those who need it. And it's in these waters that we learn to pray for our enemies and to admit when we're wrong, seeking forgiveness, and if possible, reconciliation. Baptism into this worldview, this following the ways of Jesus, is a lifelong endeavor. James and John could not understand what they were asking because they thought they'd reached the pinnacle with Jesus. They didn't know that they were at a false summit. There was more to climb in their journey, and their journeys were their own, just as Jesus had his own. Years ago, I was on the phone with my mom, and out of the blue, she started telling me about gay people being denied housing and being evicted from their apartments in Dallas solely because they were gay. Now, we didn't live in Dallas, we lived outside of Dallas, so Dallas wasn't our home, and she wasn't involved in any gay rights groups that I knew of. And so she told me how this went against a fair housing ordinance that had been put in place in the mid-70s, and that people were showing up to the city council meetings and protesting all of this. So I'm listening to this, and I had no idea what to say. So I said nothing, and she went on and on. And finally, Mama said, "Bug, are you there? Isn't that awful?" To which I said, "What in the world are you talking about? Housing rights," she said. To which I replied, "Why? Why are you concerned about this? I never once heard you talk about housing rights, especially for gay people when I was growing up. What's going on?" To which she paused and said, "What do you mean? Things change. Are you the same person you were 15 years ago?" I laughed and I said, "Touche, Mary Jane. Good for you." Good for her for being immersed in those baptismal waters that pull us into lives, seeking justice, offering mercy, and living humbly. Good for her for being in those baptismals that washed away her eyes to see clearly something she hadn't seen before. Good for her for reminding me that I never have and never will know everything. And it might be lovely to open myself to unexpected and beautiful surprises. My life with her was but a false summit, and she continued to hike without me. In the past, I'd always seen James and John as pushy bros, guys who thought too much of themselves. Today, I wonder if because of their experiences, because of what they've learned, they felt called to do more, to be more, and to ask for more with the only imagery that they had. But Jesus, to borrow from Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride, says, "I don't think this means what you think it does." As the years have passed, I look back at 26-year-old Janet and all of her confidence to stand before the students who knew so much more than she. Before Howard Kleinbell, an icon in modern pastoral care, and tell all she'd learned with bemusing arrogance, with the bemusing arrogance of James and John. And I'm really embarrassed. But no one laughed at me. And Howard even introduced me to his powerhouse of a wife, a feminist psychotherapist, Charlotte, who invited me to join women's gatherings at her house. I was fortunate enough to have people on my path all along the way to nudge me and to point me in my own path, even as we journeyed in the same direction. American Christianity, perhaps Christianity in all time since Constantine made it the state religion, has been marked by certainty. Those who say God thinks this or God thinks that, or wear this and don't wear that, say this but don't say that, think this but don't think that, don't do this with your body, etc., etc. And it's a much simpler religion. It's one where we open our heads and someone else pours in whatever they want us to know. But Jesus didn't offer that to James and John. You know, you can't come with me because you don't really know what that means. You have your own path. You must take it, and it's not mine. I've had so many stumbles on this path of Christianity. And I've wondered more often than not if I really belong here. And the older I get, the less confident in so many things I become. Confidence is replaced with curiosity, sometimes bemused understanding, even embarrassment. But all along this path, there have been kind classmates, wise elders, soul friends who've held me accountable, those who have loved me to wholeness when I've stumbled, and others who had my back when I was compelled to do an unpopular thing. I suppose we could say that we were all people living into our baptismal covenants with one another. What's your path? It may not be that you're too anxious to speak up. It may be that you don't speak up enough. It may be that you're quiet. Where have you drunk from the cup of self-surrender? Who walks with you, before you, behind you, and beside you on this peculiar path of Christian faith? Trust me, at some point along the way, you'll be like James and John and ask embarrassing questions along the way. And trust me, you'll need the support of people you don't know along the way. I encourage you and I remind myself to find those walking in the same direction, even if it's a different path, because it will be. It's what Jesus recommended. Amen.